Hi, welcome to the show. My name is Rebecca Painter, and I'll be your host for today. I've been in conversations with many of you over the last few months, and every time I talk with you, it just feels like there's this pit of dread in your stomach because you're watching what's happening in Washington, D.C., and it has just gotten so out of control. That's the reason why I was really itchy to get back onto America at its best and share some good news that you guys are making possible. Because when you look beyond Washington, D.C., and you look into the states, we are seeing really big things happening. And you guys are making those things happen. Today, we're going to talk about something that I hope makes you want to jump out of your chair in excitement, because it is a big, big deal for our country. Soon in West Virginia, parents all across the state are going to be able to decide which school is best for their children. And the beautiful thing about this is that this policy, we're not going to let it live and die in West Virginia. We are going to make sure that this kind of state solution travels all across the country for national impact. And we want to see it come to your state soon. So please join me in just a few minutes as we welcome Garrett Balangi, who is the CEO of the Cardinal Institute in West Virginia, who's going to tell us how this big win became possible and what's ahead in terms of challenges on implementation. But before Garrett joins us, I've invited Lynn Harsh to the show. Some of you may know Lynn. She's SPN's Vice President for Strategy. The reason I asked her to come here today is she's a bit of an old timer in that she's been here for more than 10 years. She saw what West Virginia was like back in what I like to refer to as the olden days before this win. And she's going to give us a little context to help us understand how West Virginia went from where it used to be, as we all knew it, to where they are today on the cutting edge. Lynn, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Rebecca. Appreciate it. Good to see you.
You too.
Not so how I feel about being called an old timer.
I wasn't sure how you'd feel either. It just sort of popped in my head. But you've been around a long time. You've seen some things, and you talk about West Virginia as it used to be before this win. So take us back about 7 years. All right. What was the landscape like in West Virginia?
Well, it was in 2014. I was in the Dalles, Oregon, when the election results came in from around the country, including West Virginia. And I will describe it as a tsunami. After 80 plus years of one party union rule, that had been replaced by a bevy of center-right lawmakers. The replacement happened from the state house all the way through the U.S. House and the Senate, and all the spots in between. It was a tsunami. And how that happened, we'll have to wait for another show. That's fascinating. But in reality, at that point in time, West Virginia had a lot of opportunity and very little in the way of traditions or structure or connective tissue to take advantage of that opportunity to build a new path forward.
So 2014, that state had been mostly under government union control. Things had turned. Tell us about Cardinal. What was that looking like back in 2014?
Well, it's really interesting because I was visiting with my mom, wondering about what we're going to do about this stuff. And one of the creators of this tsunami called Keith Pauley. He had started Cardinal with a group of his friends, a group of colleagues, in the hopes that over 2 to 4 years, while they were working on maybe some changes with who was going to govern West Virginia, that over those 2 or 4 years, they could build some intellectual capital and some processes to be a genuine part of that solution when the time came. And then all of a sudden, here they were with a brand new institute, months old, hoping to have 2 to 4 years to build it. And they had this huge opportunity, no full-time director, and a very big job.
So Keith called you and asked you to come to West Virginia, right? And he was just a board member. Like you said, they didn't have anyone running the place. Yeah. What happened when you landed?
Well, Keith was trying to do as much on the day-to-day management as he could, but he's a businessman. He has a business to run. And I will tell you that from the moment I landed in West Virginia, I kind of fell in love with the place. It's an amazing state. But what was happening on the ground was both marvelous and scary because it was pretty chaotic. For example, school choice was a big deal to a lot of people who got elected. And so there were 40 plus school choice bills alone, many of which didn't have any connection to each other. Many of the bill authors didn't write the bill so that it could get through a committee. Fiscal notes were few and far between. And so there was just a lot of stuff going on. And Cardinal was trying to do its very best to not only build some intellectual capital there, but to help with the structure on the ground. So I brought some colleagues in. We met with some committee staff and chairman, the speaker, one of the senators who did provide a lot of structure in those days, who's now on Cardinal's board, excellent senator. And we talked about the budget, we talked about taxes, key reforms, how to build a strategy for those things. So externally at the state capitol, with Keith and the assistance of his new board, they set up these meetings, and some colleagues and I from SPN did our best to try to help put some structure and focus into that incredible opportunity.
And looking back now, how did the SPN team and you leading that team help the infrastructure inside of the Cardinal Institute in those early years?
Right. It's one of those things where you've heard about, flying the airplane while you're building it or riding the bike while you're building it. That's what it was for Cardinal, because they had this huge opportunity at the same time as they had to build their own infrastructure. So we tried to help them with some strategic frameworks, some key objectives, how to think about focusing the many different opportunities that were in front of them. You can't do them all. They had to put a budget together, raise money. They have a C3, C4 structure in West Virginia that's very unique, had to work through the entanglements of that. And last but not least, they had to hire a talented full-time director. So all that was going on simultaneous to them working with legislative priorities.
Yeah, well, thank you, Lynn. That is such a good glimpse into how things like this get started. Opportunity at the State House, a new organization getting up and running, and in 7 years, which actually is kind of short in the policy world, we see a win like this that can make an impact all over the country. And I love your intro to Garrett. Let's bring him on and talk to Garrett.
May I tell you a little bit about Garrett?
Yeah, sure. You
know what, they had this situation where they needed to find someone who loved West Virginia, who loved West Virginians, who weren't going to fall into the same stereotype that we all have about that amazing, incredible, beautiful state. Somebody who had hope and opportunity in his mind, and who had intellectual capacity to pull all these policy pieces together. And I think who's curious and hungry to get these wins. I'm telling you what, that's a tall order. That's a very tall order. And so here we meet the person who said yes to that job and has been building ever since. So I just wanted to throw that in because, Garrett, I have amazing admiration for you and your board who made that hire and put you in that seat. So I will now let this go on to you, Garrett. Thank you.
Thank you, Lynn. With that kind of introduction, I think she said all we need to say to introduce Garrett. Welcome to the show. We're so glad you're here.
Well, hey, thank you for having me. It's an absolute pleasure. And as Lynn was talking about this executive director, I was wondering who she was referencing. But no, in all seriousness, it's an absolute pleasure to be here with everyone today.
Well, Garrett, let's dive right in. For those who don't know, what is the Hope Scholarship?
The Hope Scholarship is quite simply and boldly, I think, the gold standard school choice policy in the entire country. The Hope Scholarship is really the culmination of 5 years of effort where we had ESA bills ran after ESA bills, and it really culminated in April of this year whenever it passed the West Virginia Senate, the West Virginia House, and the governor's eventual signature was on the bill. What it basically says is that 9 out of 10 kids in West Virginia are eligible for just that school choice. So they will be able to take 100% of the state funding and choose and design an educational experience that best suits his or her needs. Contextually speaking, 4 or 5 years ago, West Virginia had no form of school choice, not even charter schools, not even mandatory open enrollment. And in that short period of time, here we are talking about a gold standard public policy like the Hope Scholarship.
Wow. And we're talking about these kids. I've heard you've been flooded with emails and phone calls thanking you for this and a lot of support along the way. Tell us about some of the parents or grandparents you're hearing from.
Honestly, the day the bill got passed, we were getting phone calls, we were getting emails, really just, hey, are we eligible? What is this? We've heard all of this about this new scholarship program. What does this mean? And it's really, I think, kind of It's regenerative in some ways because you go through these fights year after year after year. And sometimes you always wonder, who are we going to help? Who is out there? Is there going to be a demand for this? And frankly, that question has been put to bed. And we've had some really great interactions since this bill was passed. And I can't wait to begin to tell some of these stories.
Good. That's great. Now, what do you think the secret sauce was to getting this passed? Because other states have tried and haven't quite gotten there yet.
Yeah, that is the magic question, isn't it? What is the secret sauce? And I think obviously victory has 1,000 fathers, and you have to make sure there are certain elements in place, I think, to any kind of victory like this. One is clearly research. You have to have a platform off of which you can use to go out into the public forums and say, look at what we're seeing, look at what we've discovered, look at what the research is saying. You have to begin then to attract allies and potential coalition members to your cause. How do you do that? You go out and meet the public where they are. And that was one of my favorite things, is going out and meeting West Virginians all across this beautiful state and just, hey, do you have a meeting of 5 people? Although I have to drive 3 hours, I would love to come talk to you about school choice. Over time, you begin to attract the right allies. You have the research. You have to make sure that the issue is fresh in the public's mind. So you have to constantly be doing op-eds and be talking to people. And at the end of the day, you have to make sure your coalition and its legislative allies they have the same vision that you do, they have the same goal that you do, and that everybody is utilizing their comparative advantage to make sure that goal is eventually achieved, which it was in April of 21.
So Nisi Hamilton, Nisi, welcome back to the show. Glad you're with us. Submitted a really great question before the show. And I want to follow up with her question, which is, do you think that the exposure of parents during COVID to the content of what their kids were learning maybe played a role in the parents' appetite for this? And second part, what were you guys able to do to overcome the teachers' unions and win?
I think that COVID-19 was frankly the straw that broke the camel's back. I don't think it was the primary reason for this. Certainly, I think as parents were exposed to what their children were learning, many of them, especially in a place like West Virginia, probably disagreed with sort of the tenets and some of the fundamentals their kids were learning. I think perhaps even more importantly than that, actually, though, it actually demonstrated to parents that different kids thrive in different environments. And I think in a place like West Virginia, where the school choice landscape was relatively barren, I think that perhaps was a key impetus in getting us across the line. So yeah, I'm sorry, Rebecca, remind me of the second part of that question.
The teachers unions, how did you guys get through?
Yeah, the elephant in the room, right? Yeah. So, I mean, West Virginia has a very rich history of unionism. United Mine Workers, labor strikes, the mine wars. And so our history is really intertwined with that of unionism. And so as such, the teachers unions here have an outsized influence. We saw this in 2017 and 2018 when West Virginia was really the sort of the birthplace of the Red for Ed movement. We saw consecutive years of teacher strikes. What we bring to the table is facts and data, in the willingness to get out into the public forum and debate these things. Do not allow these claims to go unchallenged. And eventually, I think what we saw in West Virginia is that the unions came to be seen as something of a paper tiger. They had arguments that frankly made zero sense once you actually challenged them in a public way. And I think too, in a place like West Virginia that's been longing for just a different set of ideas, there was a bit of a cultural exhaustion with the union tactics and the way they represented themselves and their ideas. And I think you add all of that together, it's kind of a beautiful freedom potpourri, if you will.
Yeah, Garrett, I remember the speaker calling actually in 2015, and he'd been barricaded in his office or not barricaded, but the hall outside of his office was filled with union members protesting things that hadn't even happened yet. And at that point in time, there was, I think, a realization from these new lawmakers that the union wasn't going to just go away, but at the same time, some awareness that they weren't the big deal everybody thought they were going to be, just how you described it. So when did you start feeling that actual shift, seeing that actual shift?
I honestly think we began to feel it probably in 2017. That was a nice gestation period for kind of a new set of ideas to come into the state, which Cardinal was the primary vector for in some ways, and began to demonstrate to West Virginians, look, guys, this is the old way of thinking. This is why West Virginia is the butt of every joke. It's why it's the punchline for every late night comedian. And so I think that started to turn in 2017. Obviously there is a lot of kind of holdover power, right? There's still this sort of shadow of power of the old way that is still here, certainly. But again, if you come with facts, data, and a strategic approach to change, then that tiger suddenly turns into paper. And that's when you start to see some of the wins that we've had in West Virginia, whether it be right to work, whether it be charter schools, and really culminating now with the Hope Scholarship Program.
Yeah. Garrett, I want to go back to something you said a few minutes ago about how victory has 1,000 fathers. And one powerful component of SPN in this network is the ability to bring people together, national allies, local folks, to work towards the same goal. So can you tell us a little bit more about some of your key allies who were instrumental in making this possible?
Yeah, on some level, I feel a little bit embarrassed to be sitting here talking to you guys because there are so many people that played a key role in getting a victory like this. Certainly in the education realm, certainly in the Hope Scholarship realms, a few groups come to mind. Obviously, Ed Choice. Ed Choice is perhaps the premier national school choice group in the country. They were certainly a key pusher of momentum here, whether it was through research, whether it was through lobbying and things of that nature. You also have other critical groups like Americans for Prosperity West Virginia, the Institute for Justice, and they kind of form what I have been calling kind of the innermost circle of a concentric circle model of our coalition. So those four organizations kind of hand in hand really built this from the very beginning. Another group, the Atlas Network, was instrumental in getting some of this stuff done, especially early on. And SPN, this is perhaps more from a personal level, guys, but when I tell you, I got hired for the Cardinal Institute role at 27 years old. I was moving back to my home state from a job that I absolutely loved in Arlington, Virginia, and I had zero idea what I was doing. That is a very frightening proposition for somebody. And I immediately was put into contact with SPN, and they really helped me grow as a leader. They gave me the idea that you're not in this alone, and we are here to help and support you guys through especially difficult kind of formative years. Although I feel like in some ways we're still a bit of a formative year organization. But yeah, none of this gets done in a vacuum, and we have a lot of people to be thankful for. Certainly SPN is one of them.
Well, next question is for Lynn and Garrett, but I'd like Garrett to answer it first. Garrett, what does this mean for other states? Like I said, there's no way we're only letting this happen in West Virginia.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are surprised that this happened in West Virginia for some of the reasons that I detailed earlier, for some of the reasons that West Virginia is traditionally thought of a backward state in some ways. But I think similar to right to work was passed in West Virginia. Then you saw 2 or 3 other states quickly thereafter pass similar bills. And so I think what happened here in April of this year was something like a school choice earthquake. And I think the aftershocks are still happening. I'll be honest, guys, we've had conversations probably with 8 to 10 states already, some of whom were official representatives for governor's offices, some of whom are our SPN affiliates, and some of whom are just parents and other groups that are interested in how we got something like this done. And so I think over the next probably 2 to 3 years, you're going to see some states really challenge the Hope Scholarships title as the gold standard policy. And frankly, that's a great thing. And I can't wait to get out there on the road and really talk to some of these folks.
Well, yes, you've built momentum and blazed a trail for us to follow. And if I have anything to say about it, it'll be even shorter than 2 or 3 years. I'm very impatient about these things. But here's the other thing for me that really needs to be different for us this time. We are on the field now, thanks to you. You guys are on the field, or at least you're looking at the field. Now we have to score some points. We can't leave it here. The support you need has just started in very many ways. So help us understand what's next. And in my mind, it's an urgent next, but what's next, Gary?
Yeah, honestly, I think this is where conservatives and libertarians and affiliated organizations really kind of drop the ball in some ways, which is ex post, right? Now what? So the bill was passed. What do we do? And I think oftentimes this is because of a libertarian proclivity or a free market proclivity. We don't fill ourselves in the bureaucracies. We don't populate the institutions that are now put in charge of implementing some of these great free market reforms. So what we need to do now is make sure the implementation process goes smoothly, both from an administrative, governmental perspective, but also from a marketing perspective, from getting out there and talking to folks. I think sometimes those of us in think tanks or do tanks or whatever we want to call ourselves, we forget we have to meet people where they are. We forget that other people are busy living their lives. And so while ESAs have been sort of the primary objective of my professional life for the last 4 or 5 years, there's maybe 10 other people that could say something similar in West Virginia. And so we have to market this. We have to tell parents about it. We have to paint a different vision of the future for parents and families. Because frankly, the Hope Scholarship Program isn't important just for West Virginia. It really is important for the broader school choice movement in much the same way that Kansas tax reform is always brought up by the progressive left as an example of this is why you cannot cut taxes. We simply cannot allow that to happen with the Hope Scholarship Program. So we need to go to fairs and festivals. We need to market this. We have to create a Hope Scholarship brand. We want to turn it into really a third rail of West Virginia politics. And the best way of doing that is getting parental and private advocates, and that's going to be our number one objective over the next few years.
So you guys are all about implementation right now and making sure you do that the right way.
Yeah, absolutely. Of course, there are some other, West Virginia, sadly, in a way, is a target-rich environment for free market reforms. It's one of the reasons why we're number 49 or number 50 on per capita income. But as it relates to education choice, this is going to be the primary objective of the Cardinal Institute moving forward. How do we implement this? How do we get people signed up? And how do we make sure that any of the growing pains that are bound to come up with a program of this size, how are those as smooth as possible so that we can create as user-friendly of an environment as we can?
Yes, I love that. And I also would, anybody who has ideas on supply side for West Virginia, boy, send them in to us, because that's going to be another key issue is now that the opportunity exists, have to provide the products and services now. So teachers.
Lynn, if I may just cut in briefly, that is so important. West Virginia is an afterthought a lot of times when it's from tech innovation, edupreneurship. The philanthropic community is oftentimes overlooked West Virginia. And I think this is such an amazing opportunity for sort of I really call West Virginia kind of a petri dish, because I equate West Virginia's policy environment to a balloon that's been absolutely filled to the brim with air. And it just takes a little bit of a strategic pin on that. And really a lot of these reforms are to come bursting forward. So the supply side is key. But I really think now every child nearly in the state is going to have $4,600 in their back pocket to really go out and create a unique environment. And I think that's going to gin up some awesome supply innovations.
Garrett, I want to move over to some questions from our audience. You just mentioned the $4,600 or $4,800. Quentin Oram, thanks for joining the show today, had a question wondering what % of private schools cost less than $5,000 a year? I think this comes up a lot where some private schools are skyrocketed way above that, others aren't. What's that landscape in West Virginia?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we did a survey, I think in 2018, actually. We went out and surveyed 35 or 40 private schools in West Virginia. As a matter of fact, in partnership with Ed Choice, whom I mentioned earlier. And we just wanted to get an idea of how many open seats do you guys have? What are your tuition rates? And it turns out the median tuition, at least among that, we think a statistically relevant, statistically significant survey is about $4,800. There are certain schools that are obviously well above that. But the median tuition for a private school in West Virginia is about $4,500 to $4,800.
And so would they then be able to use leftover money for non-tuition expenses?
Oh my goodness, this is perhaps the most exciting part of the Hope Scholarship bill, is this bill is going to be as flexible as possible in approved education expenses. So not only is it for private school tuition, it's for tutoring, it's for education therapy, it is for really the only limits are, is this a legitimate education expense, which the West Virginia State Treasurer will be tasked with authorizing is your imagination. And so again, we're hoping to see new therapies come into West Virginia, new micro schools be started up, new charter schools, public-private partnerships, leveraging that $4,600 in the Hope Scholarship account. And so really, I think West Virginia is going to quickly become kind of the innovation hub and tailoring hub of education, at least as it relates to K-12.
Wow. Okay. Next question. Both Walt Rogers and John Hendrickson, thanks for joining the show, guys, had a question that's similar, wondering how you guys were able to convince rural legislators that school choice won't hurt their small town schools. And can you talk to us a little bit about how they responded to school choice and ESA policy at the beginning?
So this is one of the eternal conundrums that a lot of school choice people have and face, is how do you talk to rural Republicans? Of course, there will always be a subset of them who just don't understand it, right? Or they're uncomfortable with change. What we tried to do in West Virginia was oftentimes these things are discussed in terms of threats. Oftentimes they're talking to superintendents or other allies who are talking about school choice in terms of threat. What we tried to do was change that narrative to terms of opportunity. And especially in a place like West Virginia, even rural Republicans, even rural Democrats, they want to be at the forefront of change. They want to be excited about something. And so I think it was incumbent on groups like Cardinal and others across the state and frankly across the country to begin talking about school choice in terms of a different vision, a different future, in terms of opportunity. And the other thing that we have is data. This is not the first school choice program ever implemented in an area with rural areas. So you can look to places like Indiana, you can look to places like Ohio, you can look to places like Arizona and see, have school choice programs actually manifested a threat to rural areas in the way in which opponents characterize them? And the answer is no. And so that's always a good thing to bring up too.
It has been such a challenge. It's good the tide's starting to turn there. And we can't have a show without a great question from our friend Ed Johnson. Ed, thanks for joining. How close is West Virginia to having the money follow the student rather than the school system, Garrett?
Oh my goodness, what a wonderful, this is near and dear to my own heart. We're very close, my friend. This is about as close as it's going to get. So as you likely know, education funding, it tends to be three buckets. You have federal, state, and local. For political reasons, for legal reasons, you can't really touch the federal money. For primarily political reasons, you really don't touch the local funding. So you're left with state funding, and the Hope Scholarship Program provides 100% of the state funding portion to follow that child. So it's basically like depositing $4,600 in a backpack and letting them go forth and prosper. And so that's about as close as you're going to get, at least in West Virginia, and probably in the near term.
Good. Okay, well, we have more questions and we are out of time, but we'll make sure that Garrett and or someone from our team gets back to those of you who submitted questions earlier on. Garrett and Lynn, I want to thank you guys for being here and give you a minute to offer some final thoughts. Garrett, as you offer your final thoughts, I really, more than anything, want to know what our viewers can do to help you, especially as you embark on implementation, because no pressure, but we need you to get this right for the rest of the country.
If I may, I think my final remark could be best characterized as gratitude. I wanted to give it a theme. I want to thank SPN. I want to thank Ed Choice and all of these other wonderful organizations that really made this possible. If it wasn't for them, we would not be sitting here. But obviously, if you back that up even further, it's the generosity of donors and supporters who are willing to go hand in hand with groups like the Cardinal Institute, with groups like the State Policy Network, that are willing to go year after year, fight the good fight, and stand behind us and stand beside of us. So all of the donors, all of the philanthropic community that's out there, for me, from the bottom of my heart, I want to thank you guys for everything that you've done to allow this to happen. The second part of your question, Rebecca, is implementation. We are going to be watching this like a hawk. We are going to be going out to fairs and festivals, events across the state. I want billboards all over the state talking about the Hope Scholarship Program. I want op-eds in all of the newspapers. I want to create an ambassador program for parents in different sections of the state so they can go out and talk to their own communities. So that's the implementation side. But again, I just sincerely want to thank everybody for allowing this victory to happen.
Thank you, Garrett. Thank you, Rebecca, for bringing this all to fore with these great supporters. And this, in my opinion, school choice, that's the virus we need to spread. So let's put ourselves into this full force and help you get this done so we can have another call this year about where it's going next. Thank you.
Thanks, Lynn. Thank you, Garrett. Thank you guys for joining our show again this month. I can't stress enough. I know when you look at DC, it's awful and we're all very disturbed, but this is a big deal. What happened in West Virginia is a big deal. You guys are making a lot of things like this happen in states all across the country. So thank you. We're going to keep at it and we will keep you posted on our next show in July. Thanks and have a great rest of your day.